So for those of you that couldn't make it to class today, I wanted to just go ahead and narrate a short PowerPoint so that you didn't have to sit through a super long recorded Zoom session. Essentially, I started class by talking about this diagram of planetary boundaries. This is actually a slide that I showed on the first day of class when we talked about the Anthropocene. And it's really important because it directly ties to food systems. And specifically, it ties to food systems in a couple of different ways. In one way, genetic diversity is really important. And so I talked in class today about GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, and how we have really exceeded the planetary boundaries in terms of genetic diversity, both of like non-food and food organisms. And in the food context, it really has to do with the fact that we have only about 12 different crops that are all genetically modified organisms that we produce in massive quantities to feed the people on our planet. The problem with that is that it disrupts sort of traditional seed saving and seed line planting and growing. So when you have a GMO, Monsanto and other companies own the germplasm. They're hybrids, meaning that they're sterile. And so unlike people have done for thousands of years, that people cannot simply sow the seed, grow the crop, eat the food, and save the seed for next year because the seeds are inviable. Likewise, although GMO plants are grown because they're resistant to pesticides and also because they are able to grow in droughty areas, they're very drought resistant, the genetic diversity is really reduced, meaning that if we have some kind of environmental threat or disaster happen, our global food system might be at risk to some of these events when we are basically dependent on only a few crops for growing our foods. The other thing is that land use and land system change and biogeochemical flows are sort of two other ways in which exceeding our planetary boundaries are really important when we think about food systems. And so if you look here, this circle around the question mark, what you see is that the red areas are areas in which we are likely exceeding the Earth's capacity to sustain humanity. And so what we see here is that land use conversion, right, conversion of forest to pasture land for growing livestock, is a major way in which our food systems are impacting these planetary boundaries. Likewise, we already know a lot about the phosphorus and nitrogen cycle, and we know that we are widespread and broadcasting these types of fertilizers across all of our Earth's agricultural systems, or at least all those that are not organic. And so by doing so, we're really depending on these soil nutrients and fertilizers to produce food and feed the people on our planet, but we're doing it at a rate that's not sustainable. So think back to that lecture on ecological footprints, and you'll sort of see how that's happening. And so this idea of planetary boundaries came up in a long time ago, actually, and has been revised more recently. Rockstrom, who's the guy who you read the article about the Anthropocene on our first day of class, and then Will Steffen, who's also one of the founders of the coin, the Anthropocene, came up with to sort of think about how we as a global community are exceeding the amount of resources that our Earth can provide. Another component here, this is also a slide from the first day of class, that we see is that humans are really responsible for some of these energy flows and some of these relationships between the different the different planetary boundaries. And so when we look at land system change or land system conversion, that really is closely tied to things like biogeochemical cycling. And that, of course, is related to our food production system. Another concept that I'd like to talk about is the idea of donut economics in the context of planetary boundaries. And so Kate Raworth came up with this idea of donut economics, in which there's sort of two different ways in which we can think about planetary boundaries. One is in the context of these ecologically safe planetary boundaries, right? So what we talked about in the last slide, but then the second is thinking about what are ways in which we can live in a just society where we are not exceeding ecological boundaries. And so on the left, what you see is the United States, where we're largely exceeding the planetary boundaries for many, many different components of the planetary resources that we have. But at the same time, our social thresholds are largely being met, which means that we are largely meeting the needs of people, but we're doing it at the expense of consuming lots and lots of resources. Now, on the right-hand side, what we see is that in a country like Sri Lanka, the residents in Sri Lanka are largely not exceeding the biophysical planetary boundaries, so they're operating in this ecologically safe operating space, but that happens at the expense of social justice, right? And so things like life satisfaction, like equity, like democratic equality, like nutrition are not being met. And so the idea behind working in these safe operating spaces is that we want, the target is somewhere in here between the socially just and the ecologically safe boundary, and therefore within the donut somewhere. And so this figure is another figure from the O'Neill article, which was based off of this idea of donut economics and on socially just and ecologically safe operating spaces. And what we see here is that if you look on a country by country scale, a country like the United States is right here, and that was from the last example, right? So again, we're transgressing the biophysical boundary, but our social thresholds are met. Likewise, a country like Sri Lanka falls over here. Vietnam is sort of an outlier. What we don't see is a lot of countries that are achieving the social thresholds and not exceeding the biophysical boundary. So why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because we're talking about food systems. And when we talk about food systems, they're directly tied to our ability for the earth to provide what we need to live on the planet, but also we have to think about how the earth is going to feed us. And so the idea of working within these planetary boundaries in terms of developing and moving forward with sustainable food systems is important. And so this image is really showing us the idea of the yield gap, right? And so in the United States and in the global north and across the globe, people are consuming lots and lots of meats, over 300% almost of the meat that we need to stay within a healthy boundary for ourselves in terms of the nutrition that we need. And whereas countries like sub-Saharan that are in sub-Saharan Africa are largely eating a starch-based diet, but they're not necessarily, well, they might be meeting their caloric needs. They may not be meeting their caloric needs, but they are also likely not eating a very diversified group of foods that are nutritious. So remember back to these ideas of food justice. Food justice deals with these concepts of providing nutritious, culturally appropriate foods to all people. This is an article that came out after the food article, the Sustainable Food Systems article that I posted for class. And it sort of talks about how we might be able to transform our food system and still provide plenty of calories for the planet and still exist within a safe operating space. So there were other diagrams in here as well, but the other figures talk, this is sort of the summary figure panel H for this article, talking about how doing that would require us to restore biosphere integrity, land use, reduce food loss, improve nutrient and water management, and restore freshwater use and nutrients. The question is, can we feed the planet and transform our food system? Again, this article suggests that yes, in fact, if we adopt some of these systems, we can still feed the people on the planet, and we can do it in a socially just and culturally appropriate way. And so then I ended the class with talking about picking countries on this graph here and thinking about ways in which individual countries might develop sustainable food systems. And so we broke up into breakout groups, and in pairs, students picked different countries. And so, for example, a country like Japan has a pretty large economy. People are moving out of agricultural areas, and but they also need rice. So 3 billion people on the planet eat rice, and so we went back and talked about some of these Project Drawdown suggestions for thinking about how we might decarbonize. And so countries that depend on rice, lots of countries in India, Asia, other parts of Asia, etc. We can talk about how you might reduce methane concentrations by reducing the amount of water that's needed to cultivate rice. And things like that. And then we also talked about other countries like in sub-Saharan Africa needing to meet basic nutrition requirements, but that also diversification of high nutrient crops was necessary. Other countries like Ukraine have had this really interesting political history in their recent past where we've had a massive restructuring, and so people are eating different kinds of food than they've eaten in the past, but they're not necessarily very nutritive, and so there are problems associated with obesity, which is the flip side of the food justice coin, right? Which is to say that you may be getting enough calories, but they aren't necessarily high quality calories. And so that was basically class, and thanks so much for listening.